Welcome to the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Right now, we're going through the entire Bible to understand it as one big, cohesive story. We're covering one book each day, and this one is about Matthew.
This is the most excited I've been for an episode that we've done so far together as we're going through the Bible one book per day until we're done. The book of Matthew is not only my favorite book of the Bible, it is my favorite book of everything. It's my favorite thing that's ever been written by anyone. And first and foremost, the reason for that is not just because I'm named after the guy who wrote it. That probably factors a little. But first and foremost, the biggest reason is because this is where I met Jesus of Nazareth. This is the first account I ever heard of who he was or what he's about, what he did, his life, his death, his resurrection, all of that stuff. And I'm a Christian. So as much as I like to come at the Bible academically and historically, I love narrative structure, all of that stuff's really important and exciting to me. Nothing in the Bible is more important or exciting to me than the main character of the Bible, Jesus of Nazareth. I think he's God in the flesh. I think he is the completion and the answer to everything that gets set up in the Old Testament. And so when I set out to do something like this, I'm just straight up excited because we finally get to talk directly about Jesus of Nazareth on screen here in the book of Matthew. And as I keep hinting at here, I don't think I'm going to do it justice because I just did 800 episodes on it, and I don't feel like that was even enough time to plumb all of the depths of the awesomeness of this book. So I'm just amped, and I'm excited to talk to you about this first book of the New Testament, the book of Matthew. And the New Testament is a whole new chunk of Bible. Practitioners of Judaism acknowledge the Old Testament, and have for millennia, as the Bible. Now, Christians also acknowledge the Old Testament as the Bible. In fact, there are even some para-Christian religions that would also acknowledge the Old Testament in one way or another as the Bible. But here we come to a fork in the road because practitioners of historical Judaism do not view the New Testament as Bible. And the big dividing point here is the main character. It's Jesus of Nazareth. Christians look at that and say, that guy right there is the continuation, the completion, the fulfillment of all of the stories and all of the laws and all of the poetry and all of the wisdom and all of the ups and downs of the narrative and all of the prophecy, subtle and overt, of the entire Old Testament. It all points to him. So for those of us who believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the promised king who is to reign on the throne of David, the realization of that glimmer of hope that we see wedged into all the little cracks between downers and calamities throughout the whole story of the Old Testament, we think Jesus is that guy. And so the New Testament is just a continuation of the Old Testament. All the themes follow through. All the payoffs are there. Same God, same religion. This is the exact same thing rolling on into history. Well, there are some people who don't see it that way and are still looking for that promised king, that promised Messiah to come. And that is the genesis of that historical distinction. Well, Matthew's the first book not only of the New Testament, but Matthew is also the first book of the first section of the New Testament, which we refer to collectively as the Gospels. It's these four parallel accounts that all tell the story of Jesus of Nazareth, his miracles, his life, his teaching, his death, his resurrection, what happened after he rose from the grave. But Matthew is not just an interchangeable part with these other three accounts of the life of Jesus called the Gospels. He's doing something truly unique. Matthew is writing to the Jews. He is a Jewish guy. Now, he sold out his own people to go and side with the Romans and collect taxes from his Jewish brothers and sisters, but that kind of gets worked out in the course of the book that he's written here. But Matthew's big interest is in showing that the story of Jesus is in complete continuity with the Old Testament, that it's the fulfillment and the completion of everything we've seen up to this point, and that Jesus is indeed that promised king that we've all been waiting for all of these ugly cycles of history to finally be broken, for the human problem to finally be addressed, and for this new family of faith to get created that is bigger than just the Jewish people, but certainly includes them, wherein all of the nations start to come and learn about how to worship God and learn who God is. All of that stuff, Matthew is really emphasizing and pointing out here. Also, Matthew puts more emphasis on the words of Jesus than any of these other Gospels. Now, these 4 Gospels, they're all narrative, but they're all narrative that have a lot of conversation and speeches woven into them, particularly from Jesus. But most of all, Matthew does that. Over half of the total word count, nearly 60% of the total word count of the book of Matthew is just Jesus talking. That's more than any of the other 3 Gospels. And in fact, Matthew has structured his whole book around 5 big speeches that Jesus gives. And these 5 speeches walk you right through the obvious list of questions that the original audience, a bunch of Jewish people who've been waiting a long time for this Messiah to show up, and they're starting to get a little discouraged and impatient, would be asking. Matthew references tons of Bible. Over 50 times he explicitly quotes from the Old Testament, and he alludes to or references the Old Testament far more even than that. Matthew's book is absolutely steeped in what we just got done looking at. And that's probably the reason that chapter 1 opens with a genealogy. And if you're just reading straight through the Bible, you might get to this point and be like, are you kidding me? Another list of names? Why does this matter so much? Well, it matters because each of those names on that list, one, is meant to remind a Jewish audience member or somebody who's recently gone through the Old Testament of all kinds of the stories that demonstrate how God has remembered and been faithful, and also how his people have bumbled and have been unable to hold up their end of the bargain. And that's not a Jewish problem, that's an everybody problem. The Old Testament paints a crystal clear picture of the brokenness of humanity and our inability to fix the human condition. We clearly are going to need God to introduce a new paradigm in order to bring about redemption, because we tried all the other paradigms and they didn't work. So going through this list of names, one, reminds us of the themes and the setup for the whole story and what is left to be completed. But two, going through these names right at the beginning is very important to Matthew's original audience, because they don't want to hear anything about anybody who's maybe a Messiah unless they are demonstrably descended from David. So we cover both of those things with this opening genealogy. And then as we move on from there into the book of Matthew, it might be a little disorienting if you just turn the page from Malachi, because 400 plus years have passed. Persia got beat by Alexander the Great and the Greeks/Macedonians. Alexander the Great died. His generals divided up the whole world. Those empires gradually faded, and one of them got defeated by the Jews, who from 164 to 63 BC had their own little individual kingdom for a while, but that failed. It looked like all of the mess from the era of the kings all the way back in the Old Testament. Clearly nothing has changed. Then along comes this new superpower, Rome. They gradually conquer everyone. And when we get to the time of the birth of Jesus in chapter 1 of the book of Matthew, we've got this brand new superpower who is the oppressor and occupier of the province of Judea and the province of Galilee. Galilee roughly corresponds to the territory of the old northern kingdom of Israel, and Judea roughly corresponds to the old southern kingdom of Judah. Well, now that we've shaken off the historical cobwebs and we're a little bit oriented, from there we get 4 chapters of prologue about Jesus' birth, about these people coming from far away who aren't Jews to worship him. This hints at this new family of faith that's going to be bigger, and how all the nations are going to come and worship in Jerusalem. And we see the resistance from the political and religious leadership as Herod tries to kill Jesus. We see Jesus get baptized by John the Baptist, who is this promised Elijah that you might remember from the minor prophets, who is to come and pave the way. The way is paved. Jesus gets baptized. The Father and the Holy Spirit show up at Jesus' baptism. The whole Trinity is there, affirming that he's the Son of God for anybody who's paying attention. But also the religious leaders show up at Jesus' baptism, and we get a foretaste of the resistance they are going to pose to Jesus throughout this story. They, not Rome, are going to be his chief enemy. In chapter 4, Jesus faces temptation in the wilderness from the devil himself. He passes the test nobody's ever passed before. He doesn't sin. And then in chapter 5, we get the first of the big five speeches around which the book of Matthew is structured. And this one is about how the kingdom is going to be. And not that the kingdom is a replacement of something from before, but that the kingdom and Jesus himself is the fulfillment of everything that came before. In what I think is the key verse of the whole book of Matthew, Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, "Don't think that I came to destroy the law and the prophets. I didn't come to destroy them, but to fulfill them." And then he goes on to talk about right relationship with God and how you can't do it even if you were allowed to make all the rules yourself. You couldn't even keep up those rules. He's intoning that there is a righteousness apart from our behavior, apart from the Old Testament law, and this is a righteousness from God. And that is how access to this new family of faith is going to be achieved. It's going to transcend ethnicity. And in this beautiful kingdom, the values are finally just and right side up. And all of that oppression and ick that we read about in the Old Testament, it gets sorted out. Well, then coming off of the mountain, people are like, that was a really good speech. I wonder if he can back it up because he taught with authority, not like our teachers of the law. And then in chapters 8 and 9, Jesus goes on to demonstrate, yeah, he does have the authority to back it up as he does all kinds of miracles, breaking the laws of time and space. And then in chapter 10, he sends out his disciples with the message that the kingdom of heaven is at hand, and so people should repent. And then in chapters 11 and 12, we start to see resistance to this as the religious leaders recognize, whoa, this is getting momentum, and this is not how we're picturing a Messiah, and this is a huge threat to the authority niche we've carved out here. We got to do something about Jesus. So they start trying to trick him and trap him, but it doesn't work. He's Jesus. He's too smart. And again, he can break the laws of time and space, which is a huge advantage for him. So now we've got that Sermon on the Mount, which is the first great big speech, chapters 5 through 7. We've got Jesus' missional discourse in chapter 10, where he sends out all the disciples and equips them to do so. That's the second big speech. Now, the third big speech happens in chapter 13, where Jesus teaches in parables in such a way that it's going to make sense to everybody who's already in on this kingdom thing. It might make sense to people who are from the squishy middle and not quite sure what to make of them. And these parables about how the development of the kingdom is going to unfold, they're not going to make any sense to the people who don't like Jesus and reject him. Well, coming off of that, we see the pressure ratchet up even more. John the Baptist gets killed by Herod, yet Jesus is still compassionate despite the fact that he's feeling the pressure. He feeds the 5,000. He feeds the 4,000 miraculously. And in chapter 16, finally, the question is absolutely pregnant. Are you actually the Messiah? And Peter is the one who steps up and is like, yeah, you are the Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus says, yeah, you're right. And that's from God, not from you. And Jesus chases that revelation by saying, not only is that true, but also I'm going to die at the hands of the religious leaders and be raised on the third day. And that sets the trajectory for the rest of the book. In chapter 18, Jesus gives his fourth big speech around which the book of Matthew is structured, where he explains what life is going to be like in the church, in this new representation of his family of faith. And then Jesus makes his way to Jerusalem, where he's received enthusiastically by the masses, but the leaders put him through the paces. It's kind of like the test that the devil gave him in chapter 4, but now it's the religious leaders, and he handles every test they throw at him with no problem whatsoever. And ultimately, it becomes clear, indeed, they're gonna kill him. Before that happens, Jesus gives his fifth big speech around which the book of Matthew is structured, and this one is about how the kingdom is going to unfold in the future and over time. And he tells his disciples, you're not going to get to know all the details of this, but here's how to live in light of the fact that this is still unfolding and that God will see through this redemptive plan to completion. Then Jesus gets arrested and tried before the religious leaders and before the Roman governor Pontius Pilate. Pilate is the one who ultimately pulls the trigger on Jesus' execution. Jesus is executed on a cross as he predicted. All of the disciples scatter, and a bunch of unlikely followers go and take care of Jesus' body. But then 3 days later, in front of a whole bunch of witnesses, he comes back to life, just like he said. Jesus goes to his disciples, restores them, and commissions them in the closing verses of the book, saying, all authority on heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I've commanded you. And surely I'm with you always to the very end of the age. And that's the end of the book. The reader, whether a Jewish person hearing this read aloud in the 1st century AD, just a few decades after all of this happened, or the person reading it right now on their tablet while riding on the subway in an English translation in North America. Either way, Matthew's throwing down the gauntlet. And he's like, this right here, Jesus, I'm telling you, this is the guy. This is the solution to the human problem. And this family of faith, whoever you are, wherever you're hearing these words, it's open to you. Matthew is a book that is meant to be responded to. When you picture the book of Matthew, visualize the crown of thorns that was placed on his head at the crucifixion. When you think about the theme, reflect on Jesus as the long-promised king who has finally arrived. And if you don't have time to read the whole thing, make sure to catch chapters 5 through 7. That's that first big speech, the Sermon on the Mount, and make sure to catch chapters 27 and 28. That's Jesus' death and resurrection. This one was a little bit longer, but I had a sneaking suspicion it was going to be, and I'm at peace with that. We got Mark tomorrow. I'm Matt. This is the 10-Minute Bible Hour podcast. Let's do this again soon.
This podcast is supported by many of you at patreon.com/the TMBH podcast. We're grateful because it supports our family.